Hello BookTube, I am back today with, as promised, a review of Frankenstein in Baghdad by Ahmed Saadawi and translated from the Arabic by Jonathan Wright. Did I get it right? Yes, Jonathan Wright. So some of you have probably already seen this floating around on BookTube. Got some attention there, came up in various TBRs and hauls, because of course was shortlisted for the Man Booker International. And also was recently shortlisted for the Arthur C. Clarke Award, which is a prize for the best sci-fi novel. So kind of interesting to see that kind of crossover happen there. And this review will be in two parts. I'll start with a non-spoilery review and then I'll follow that up with a more in-depth spoilery discussion. So if you don't want to be spoiled, you can stick around for the first part and I'll tell you when to start expecting spoilers and you can leave then. So, Frankenstein in Baghdad, written by an Iraqi set in Iraq, and a novel about kind of the aftermath of I think we now call it, there's a third Gulf War, but anyway, the 2003 American-led invasion of Iraq. I really enjoyed the novel. It is just back a satirical reimagining of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I don't quite agree with that, but I'll go into that in the spoilery discussion. But it's definitely a satirical novel, and despite being about kind of a heavy topic, you know, war and the aftermath of that invasion, throughout keeps a kind of light, somewhat satirical, somewhat comic tone that makes it not too heavy, even though it's about quite a heavy topic. So it's not quite as kind of light-hearted as, in terms of tone, as say Slaughterhouse-5, or not as flippant as Slaughterhouse-5 by Kurt Vonnegut, but it reminds me a little bit of that in terms of the tone of the story, and also some parts are a little bit Pynchon-esque maybe, but or reminded me of certain parts of Gravity's Rainbow, but I'll go into that in a bit more depth because that's somewhat spoilery, so I'll go into that later. Like I said, I highly enjoyed it. So the tone, which keeps it from being too heavy or depressing, and filled with really human characters that you really enjoy getting to know and follow and see, and that was for me one of the highlights of this book, was seeing Baghdad as a place with real people going about daily lives, and just having coffee with friends or going shopping or trying to keep their antiques business running, rather than just as a place of bombs and explosions and death, which is basically what we see in the media for the last 10 years or so. So for that alone, it's really worth the price of admission. And yeah, if you're open for some weirdness in your stories, magical realism is not quite the right term, but if you open to those kind of let's say non-realistic elements in your story, then I can highly recommend this book as a way to kind of get to know a bit more about a part of the world and get a new perspective on the life in the Middle East. Having said that, I'm now going to a bit more of a detailed spoilery discussion, so if you don't want to be spoiled, go read the book and then come back for this second part. So, if you're still here, let's dive into a little bit more depth and talk about what said on the back, a satirical reimagining of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, because for me that's kind of a key to understanding the book and what it's doing. So on a very surface level, it does seem like a reimagining of Frankenstein. So of course, apart from the fact that there's a direct reference in the title, we have also in Frankenstein in Baghdad this reanimated creature created from different corpses sewn together. But that is really also almost immediately where the parallels stop. The storylines are very different, the way of telling the story is very different. Frankenstein, of course, is an epistolary novel, whereas this is just a more straightforward narrative, although it does shift some points of views, but it's not epistolary, at least. It's mostly third person and some first person narration. And it does some interesting things with playing around with different points of view. But yeah, so that's one big difference, and also none of the characters really maps too well. So I mean, there's the monster, or what's his name in this book, which of course maps to the monster in Frankenstein, in Mary Shelley's book, and there's the monster's creator, who kind of maps, but only in the sense that he's a creator of the monster. Other than that, they're very different. So Paddy in this book, who creates the what's his name, and Frankenstein in the original, character-wise, in terms of their lives, in terms of how the plot affects them, they don't map at all really, other than being the monster's creator. So there we see the differences, and more differences start to appear. So where in Mary Shelley's book, the monster is created quite clearly by science, even if it's somewhat obscure and an ancient science that Frankenstein seems to have unearthed. The monster is definitely a scientific creation, whereas in Frankenstein in Baghdad, it's pretty unambiguously a supernatural creature created by supernatural forces and not by science, right? Hadi didn't even set about to create or bring these people back to life. He just wanted to kind of like sew these body parts together so they could be buried properly, and he was just, you know, trying to kind of give people a dignified funeral rather than bringing them back to life. And the body's only animated because of this kind of lost soul that doesn't know where else to go and then goes into the body. And there are of course multiple supernatural elements throughout. Also the thematically it's very different. So in the original Frankenstein's monster, I don't know if I fully got it. You need to read Paradise Lost to fully get what Mary Shelley intends, even though in our modern times we think of him, you know, as representing, you know, the dangers of science gone too far without ethical oversight. I don't know if Mary Shelley would have thought about science in that way at that time, and therefore would have intended that. Not that that means it's an invalid interpretation, but the original seems to deal with kind of the responsibilities of a creator with respect to his creation, and therefore I think it's not so linked to that. We have the monster kind of reading Paradise Lost and identifying with Satan. So I haven't read Paradise Lost myself, so I don't fully grasp the implications of that identification. But it's much more about the relation between creation and creator, and being rejected by a creator, and what that means. You could transfer it possibly to family dynamics as well, you know, children being rejected by the parents, and people being rejected by society, and how that influences their development and their moral sense. Whereas in Frankenstein in Baghdad, what's his name, I think pretty clearly is kind of a symbol of the violence of war and the sectarian violence caused by the war in Iraq. So this monster is of course stitched together out of body parts of initially, let's say, innocent, although that innocent is questioned later, but innocent victims of terrorist attacks or violence more generally, and goes out to seek out kind of the perpetrators of that violence to gain vengeance. And of course initially created, you know, to honor those victims, and then that evolves into gaining vengeance for these innocent victims. But of course that gaining vengeance creates new victims, and very soon the what's names would question, you know, who is responsible for, you know, killings, and if he kills someone new, you know, are they then a victim? Are they guilty? Was he justified to kill them? Should he somehow seek vengeance for the fact that he killed them? And what does that mean? Should he then, you know, seek vengeance on himself, or should he hold someone else responsible for kind of his actions? And it gets very messy and complicated, just like get the killings in real life, right? You get this cycle of violence that keeps on going, and you see that also in the what's his name, where if he does nothing and wouldn't seek out vengeance, then his body parts start decaying and drop off. At the same time, if he fulfills his vengeance seeking, then also these body parts decay and drop off. So either he has to like get vengeance for everyone he's composed out of, and then his life would be over, which he doesn't seek out. He keeps sustaining himself, and he takes body parts from the people he kills to kind of replenish himself, and in that way kind of keep the cycle of violence going. Right? And the other option would be not to seek vengeance, not to seek justice, and to just let himself decay, right? Which is kind of an interesting point in that dynamic, because part of this thing that keeps feeding the cycle of violence is people wanting, perhaps justifiably, some kind of justice or vengeance for someone who died who was innocent, right? And what the book seems to be saying is that no matter how justified such a desire may be, the only way to stop the cycle of violence is to not act on that desire, and to just let the violence die, let the monster die, right? And so that's a very clear thematic distinction, but also quite a powerful message, which is never explicitly spelled out in the book. You really have to kind of think about the implications of the rules according to which this monster seems to exist. So, given that very large division between, let's say, the original Frankenstein and this book, you could ask, why is it called Frankenstein in Baghdad, and why is that link made so explicit when it's, the similarities are quite minor, maybe saying going a bit too far, but relatively minor. And so I think it's interesting there, and now comes the part where maybe I'm overthinking things, but I think it works as an interpretation. It's interesting to think about what the book says about that. So the reason the book makes the linkage is that in the universe of this book, Frankenstein, the story by Mary Shelley, and all the various spin-offs and modern reimaginings of that seem to exist. Right? So why is what's his name is identified by one of the characters in the book as Frankenstein. And interestingly, he doesn't link it to the original Mary Shelley story. He links it to an American movie, specifically featuring Robert De Niro as the monster. Right? And then he thinks, oh, this what's his name reminds me of that movie, and therefore it's Frankenstein but in Baghdad. And where that kind of then works is, if you feel like overthinking it and finding some historical parallels. So the what's his name is identified with an American movie about an originally British story. At the same time, we know that Frankenstein, the monster in this novel, the what's his name, seems to be very clearly symbolic of sectarian violence, and the violence going on in Iraq, all the way back to the Iran-Iraq war, and forward to, let's say, the present day still. And so this violence is linked to, it's brought by Americans. It's an American movie, but that American movie is based on a British story. And in the same way, you could argue that the modern violence in Iraq is in part caused by American foreign policy, which is based on earlier British foreign policy. Right? It's a continuation of colonial British policies towards the Middle East up to, say, the Second World War, and then when America became a bigger player on the international stage, it kind of continued with similar policies and trying to gain influence. And so this book almost seems to be arguing that this violence is not natural or native to Iraq, but it is imported through an American variation on a British story. And so, I don't know if that was fully intended by the author, but I think it works as an interpretation. And I'd be very curious to hear what you think. Do leave your comments down below. And the last point I quickly want to touch on is, I said earlier in the non-spoilery part that there's a Pynchonian feel to some of the book, and that was particularly the tracking and the tracking and pursuit departments, which kind of reminded me of some of the kind of government agencies in Gravity's Rainbow. We have which is the major, whatever he was called, who chases after the main character and they throw custard pies at each other, which is part of Gravity's Rainbow that really didn't work for me at all. But so with Frankenstein Baghdad never gets that absurd, but there's a slight twinge of the absurd about the tracking and pursuit department, and although the book is very explicit about the fact that supernatural things happen and occur, right? So there's the painting of St. George that talks to the old lady at the beginning. There's the watch's name itself, which is clearly supernatural. But this tracking and pursuit department also dabbles in supernatural activities where it's really not clear whether they're doing anything real or whether it's all just in the heads. And kind of just the tone and the style of that department kind of reminded me a bit about Gravity's Rainbow. Although it's otherwise a very different book. And so I also have the feeling that tracking and pursuit department is the part of the book that went over my head the most. I think always with a satire, to really grasp it, you kind of have to understand, what the satire is satirizing, and if there are certain aspects of culture or politics that the book is poking fun at that you don't know about, then of course it's going to go over your head. Much like if you read Gulliver's Travels now, you really need footnotes to understand that it's not just a quaint adventure story, but it's really a work of satire. And the tracking and pursuit department, I have a feeling, although it was kind of humorous, I have a feeling that if I knew more about contemporary Iraqi politics, then some of that might have an even deeper impact. So those were my thoughts about Frankenstein Baghdad. I'd love to hear yours, leave them in the comments down below, and see you all next time. Bye bye.